The August heat in Natchez, Mississippi, wasn't just heat, it was punishment. A heavy, unmoving sheet of air that smothered every living thing under it. Even the cicadas, usually screaming like they owned the world, were quieter that day, as if the land itself knew something terrible was coming. But nothing, absolutely nothing, matched the fire tearing through 8-year-old Baltazar's chest as he crouched behind the crooked, weather-warped slats of the old cotton gin. His tiny fingers dug so deep into the dirt that the red Mississippi clay packed under his nails like blood. Through the narrow gap in the boards, he saw 5 men he'd been trained since birth to fear, dragging his mother, Dessa, across the yard toward the abandoned barn. She was screaming, begging, her voice breaking in ways that split him open from the inside. The men were laughing, drunk off heat, whiskey, and power. It was the kind of moment that doesn't just scar a child. It creates a new version of them. Baltazar's heart hammered. Something ancient inside him cracked, then reforged itself. Not into bravery, he was too young to name it that. Not into hatred either, this wasn't a clean emotion. This was survival weaponized into something sharp enough to cut the world. He'd been told all his life to keep his head down. Never talk back. Never look an overseer in the eye. Never, ever, make them angry. But as he saw Dessa's hands clawing at the dirt, those rules turned to ash. The barn swallowed his mother and the overseers whole. The door slammed. Her screams were muffled now, but not enough. Not nearly enough. Baltazar pressed both hands over his ears, not to block the sound, but because his body didn't know what else to do. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. His world was ending. And then he ran. Not toward the barn. Not toward the quarters. Not even toward safety. He ran toward a plan he didn't have. He'd been born on Thornhill Plantation 8 summers earlier, though summers on plantations weren't measured in warmth or joy, but in sweat, hunger, and the number of beatings handed out before breakfast. He learned to walk between cotton rows, learned to talk while hauling water jugs heavier than he was, learned to survive because his mother whispered survival into him every night. Make your heart small, baby. Small hearts don't get broken as easy. His father was a ghost sold off before Baltazar turned 1. All he had was Dessa, Celia, Ivy, and the endless grind of days that never changed. Dawn meant work. Midday meant heat stroke. Night meant exhaustion and the fragile hope of one more morning alive. Baltazar was painfully familiar with fear, but not this kind. This fear came with teeth. Earlier that day, he'd been hauling water to the field hands. His shirt, rough homespun fabric, scratched his sunburned shoulders until they stung like open wounds. The August sun sat directly overhead, turning the dirt road between the slave quarters and the fields into a burning griddle. He was heading back for more jugs when he heard something he'd never heard before. His mother's voice, but not singing, not humming like she did in the big house kitchen. This was raw, jagged terror. A single scream, 2 screams, then a desperate, choked cry that turned his blood cold. He dropped the jugs. He followed the sound, and everything after that felt like falling into a nightmare he couldn't wake from. When he reached the barn, the overseers were already pulling her inside. He recognized faces he'd memorized for survival. Jedediah Pike, the head overseer, a man who smiled when people cried. Clayton, his son, dangerously stupid and violently eager. The other 3 nameless. But their voices were burned into Baltazar's memory. They shoved Dessa onto the dirt floor. Baltazar watched through the cracks. He couldn't scream. He couldn't move. His small body trembled so violently he could hear his bones clicking. And then he ran. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to go somewhere the overseers couldn't predict. He sprinted past the overseers' quarters, past the big house, past the vegetable garden, past every place where death waited with a whip and a smirk. Something inside him screamed, if you stay, she dies. If you fight, you die. If you run, maybe someone listens. The dusty road leading to Natchez stretched ahead of him, 3 brutal miles of blazing sun, sharp rocks, thorns, and open exposure. Any slave found off the plantation without a written pass could be whipped, tortured, or killed on sight. But Baltazar didn't hesitate. His mother was dying. Rules didn't matter anymore. He ran until the ground blurred beneath him, until the heat seared the air in his lungs, until blood slicked his feet from the rocks, slicing them open, until every instinct begged him to stop, but stopping meant never seeing Dessa alive again. He didn't know how long he'd been running when he heard the thunder of hooves behind him. His heart stopped. Horses. Men. Searchers. He dove into the brush so fast, thorns tore through his shirt, stabbing his skin. He covered his mouth and stared at the dirt inches from his face. 2 horses slowed in front of him. Clayton's voice oozed over the road. "Little rat ain't far. Pa's gonna skin that boy alive once we catch him." Shouldn't interrupt a man's fun. Baltazar's entire body twitched with the urge to run, but instinct held him still. He waited. Waited. Mosquitoes bit him until his skin crawled. His breath came in hot, shallow gulps. Finally, the hoofbeats faded. He forced himself to crawl out. Then he ran again. By late afternoon, the limestone bluffs of Natchez rose ahead like a promise and a threat. Baltazar had been here only twice, both times clutching Dessa's skirt and keeping his eyes glued to the dirt. The city was a monster, loud, crowded, and stacked with white men who had the power to erase children like him. But he remembered something. A building. A sign above the door. A man whose voice carried authority. Attorney Chambers. His mother once whispered, "That lawyer. He ain't like the rest." Baltazar didn't know if she meant good or bad. He was about to find out. He slowed his pace, faking calm. A running slave child was a target. A walking slave child was suspicious, but possible. For 2 blocks, it worked. Then a white woman in a blue bonnet spotted him. "You there, where's your pass? Show it at once." He didn't have one. He did the only thing he could. He ran. Voices exploded behind him. "Run away. Stop that boy. Someone catch him." The world blurred shouts, wagons, boots, buildings, but he kept running toward the brick building he remembered. The law office. He barreled inside so fast he slammed into a tall white man reaching for his hat. Baltazar gasped through sobs. "Please, sir, they hurting my mama, 5 overseers, Thornhill Plantation, please help." The man froze. Attorney Chambers. Shock. Confusion. Something darker flickered behind his eyes. Outside, the mob's shouting grew louder. Chambers glanced toward the window, then back at Baltazar. For a breathless moment, the boy thought he was done, that this man would hand him over to save himself. Instead, Chambers grabbed his coat, snatched a thick leather folder from his desk, and said, "Come with me. Now." The world tilted. Help was real, and the next 72 hours would change Natchez forever. As the carriage rolled out of Natchez and toward Thornhill Plantation, Chambers said something that made Baltazar's skin crawl. "If what you told me is true, this could cost me my life. But it might bring Thornhill down." And with that, the battle began. The carriage wheels rattled over the hard Mississippi road, kicking dust into the dying light as Attorney Chambers drove with stiff, urgent purpose. Baltazar crouched on the floorboards just as he'd been told, hugging his arms around his chest to keep the trembling under control. Every bump sent a jolt through his small, exhausted body, but the fear inside him made the physical pain feel distant, unreal, like he wasn't really in the carriage at all. Like he'd left his body miles back on that burning road. The lawyer's jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles stood out like stone, but his voice, when he finally spoke, was low, controlled, heavy, with consequences. "Boy, what I'm doing right now could destroy everything I've built. My practice, my reputation, my life." Baltazar swallowed hard. For a terrifying moment, he wondered if Chambers was about to turn the carriage around, hand him back, let Pike and the others finish what they started. But the lawyer continued. "Men like Thornhill, they run this region. They own judges, sheriffs, merchants, pastors. You cross them, You disappear. He paused. But I've been looking for a way to challenge him for 2 years now. If your story holds, if I can prove what you're saying, this might be the chance I've been waiting for. Baltazar didn't fully understand what that meant, but he understood one thing. Someone powerful had finally chosen to listen. He lifted his head slightly. Will he hurt you if he finds out? Chambers huffed out a humorless breath. He'll try. Outside, dusk spread across the cotton fields like ink. The world was turning purple and gold. That slippery moment between day and night, when danger hides in the in-between. Baltazar's stomach twisted because the closer they got, the louder the fear became. What if they were already too late? What if Dessa wasn't alive anymore? As the plantation entrance approached, Chambers slowed the carriage and turned off the main road into a thick grove of trees. He pulled the reins, then spun to face Baltazar. Listen to me carefully. You must stay here. If Thornhill sees you with me, we lose everything. No, Baltazar whispered, panic rising. Sir, what if something happens? What if... Chambers put a firm hand on his shoulder. I'll find her. But I need a reason to inspect the property without raising suspicion. I'll say there's a legal dispute with a neighbor over a boundary line. Drilled into him since birth, Baltazar's instincts screamed, don't trust him. Don't trust any white man. But he didn't have a choice. And something about Chambers felt different. Not kinder, but determined. Like a man who'd already chosen his side. Boy, Chambers continued, if I'm not back within the hour, you run to Natchez and find Sheriff Morrison. Tell him everything. Baltazar repeated the name. Once. Twice. Again. He wouldn't forget. Chambers stepped out, straightened his jacket, grabbed his leather folder, and walked into the fading light. He lasted maybe 40 seconds. Maybe. Because no matter how many times his mother whispered survive, he couldn't sit in a carriage while she lay somewhere bleeding, dying, alone. He crept from the grove, stayed low, stayed silent, moved through shadows the way enslaved children learned from infancy. He followed the carriage tracks back to the road. By the time Chambers reached the front steps of the big house, Baltazar was already slipping through the cotton rows, ghosting behind stalks tall enough to hide him. He moved with purpose, with memory, because Thornhill Plantation was the only map he'd ever known. Every building, every corner, every blind spot. He used it all. When he reached the barn, the door sat half open. No voices, no movement, no screaming. That silence was worse than anything else. Silence meant endings. Baltazar pressed a shaking hand against his mouth to stop himself from crying out. He shifted his gaze toward the overseer quarters. There they were, Pike and his men, gathered outside, passing a bottle, laughing like they'd just finished an ordinary day's work. They wore fresh shirts, cleaned up, relaxed. They weren't monsters in appearance, just men. Baltazar hated that. Monsters are easier to defeat than men. His small fists clenched again. He wanted to run into that circle of men, take the bottle and smash it across Clayton's face, claw at Pike's eyes, scream until the sky cracked. But his mother taught him better. Be smart, not loud. Loud gets you killed. Smart gets you through. So he watched, waited, and trusted Chambers to do what he couldn't. Chambers and Thornhill appeared outside the house. Through the row of cotton, Baltazar watched them speak. Thornhill gestured broadly, irritated. Chambers nodded, calm but insistent. They walked the property line together. Then Thornhill, bored and dismissive, returned to the house. The moment he disappeared inside, Chambers veered sharply toward the barn. Baltazar held his breath as the lawyer disappeared inside. Seconds passed, then a minute, then another. Finally, Chambers emerged. His face was ash gray. His jaw trembled once before he locked it down again. He stood very still, then pulled out a notebook and began writing fast. Urgent strokes that meant he wasn't just horrified. He was documenting, building a case. And then Pike noticed him. The overseers strode toward the barn. postures shifting from lazy swagger to something darker. Baltazar's heart pounded so loudly he thought they'd hear it from across the yard. Chambers didn't back up, didn't flinch. He walked straight toward them, closing the distance. "Gentlemen," he called, his voice carrying clearly, "I'd like to speak with you about an incident that occurred here earlier today." Pike snorted. "What incident? We've been working. Ain't nothing to talk about." Chambers flipped open his notebook like it was a weapon. "Then perhaps you can explain why a woman named Dessa is lying beaten and barely conscious in your barn. Or why a terrified child ran into town screaming that his mother was being attacked by 5 overseers." The men stiffened. Clayton reached for the whip at his belt, but Pike grabbed his wrist, stopping him. Clayton's eyes blazed with fury. Meanwhile, field hands paused mid-step. House servants leaned out of windows. Even chickens scratched quieter. A strange, electric hush fell over the yard. People were watching, and that made men like Pike extremely dangerous. The plantation master burst out of his office like someone had set the building on fire. "Chambers, what in blazes are you doing on my property accusing my men of crimes? You have no authority here." But Chambers didn't yield an inch. In fact, he smiled. Not kindly, not nervously, a lawyer's smile. "On the contrary, Christopher," he said, addressing Thornhill by his first name, a deliberate insult. "I have every authority. Assault, rape, conspiracy. I have evidence of all 3. Thornhill scoffed. "Evidence? You have the word of a slave child." Chambers glanced around. "I have my own testimony. I have injuries consistent with violent assault. I have the behavior of men who were clearly hiding something." He pulled papers from his folder. "And I have 2 years' worth of documentation on the illegal practices of this plantation, including unrecorded births, suspicious deaths, and—" he paused. "Tax evasion." The entire crowd shifted. That was the word. Tax. Federal. Criminal. The overseers paled. Thornhill froze. Chambers leaned in. "You've been selling children off the books, avoiding federal taxes on human property transactions. If federal agents learn of this, your plantation falls. And your neighbors, too." Thornhill swallowed hard. This wasn't a fight about Dessa anymore. This was existential. Chambers outlined his terms. Dessa and her children freed immediately. Manumission papers filed and stamped. $50 travel funds. Pike and the 4 overseers permanently barred from the county. Thornhill's voice was low and venomous. "You're insane. I'll do no such thing." Chambers closed his notebook. "Then I file charges. Publicly. And the federal government starts digging. Deep." The tension cracked like a whip. Thornhill's face twitched. His authority so absolute his entire life was suddenly fragile. Finally, he exhaled shakily. "Fine. Take the woman and the brats. I'll draw up the papers." Pike snarled. "You don't know what you started, lawyer." Chambers stepped toward him until their faces were inches apart. "Oh, I know exactly what I've started." Chambers entered the barn. Seconds later, he returned, supporting Dessa, whose legs barely held her. Her dress was torn, her skin bruised, her breathing shallow. But she was alive. Baltazar couldn't hold back anymore. He burst from the cotton rows, sprinting across open yard with his entire soul pouring through his legs. "Mama!" Dessa's eyes found him, and through the pain, her face softened into the faintest, fiercest smile. "Baby, what did you do?" Baltazar threw his arms around her waist, sobbing into what remained of her dress. "I ran, Mama. I ran like you taught me. I ran for help." She cupped the back of his head with a trembling hand. "You saved me." Within the hour, Thornhill's scribbled manumission papers were placed into Chambers' hands. The house servants quietly gathered Dessa's belongings and the 2 little girls, Celia and Ivy, who clung to their mother like frightened birds. Pike and his men stood in the yard, seething, powerless, burning with hatred. Baltazar met Clayton's gaze for half a second. Clayton smiled slow, cruel, promising. But Chambers blocked the boys' view and ushered them into the carriage. Eyes forward, Baltazar. You don't look back at men you've defeated. The plantation gates closed behind them. For the first time in their lives, the family was leaving Thornhill Plantation, not in chains, but as free people. But freedom wasn't safety. Not yet. Not by a long shot. Night fell over Natchez like a blanket dipped in indigo ink. The sky glowed faintly above the rooftops. Lantern light flickered against brick walls, and the Mississippi River murmured somewhere beyond the bluffs, a deep, endless current moving toward places most enslaved people only dreamed about. The carriage that carried Dessa and her 3 children rattled over the cobblestones until it stopped in front of a modest house on Silver Street. It wasn't grand. It wasn't imposing, but it radiated something rare, something Baltazar had never felt before. Safety. The door opened before Chambers could knock. A black woman stepped out, framed by the warm light inside. Ada. Her eyes swept over Dessa once, and that was enough. With practiced calm, she grabbed Dessa's arm gently, supported her weight, and guided her inside without asking a single question. Baltazar, Celia, and Ivy followed, their feet dragging with exhaustion, confusion, and fear. The moment they crossed the threshold, a smell hit them: cornbread, herbs, something savory, something warm. A smell that didn't belong to plantations or punishment. A smell that whispered, "You're allowed to breathe here." Ada spoke briskly as she helped Dessa onto a bed prepared with sheets so clean and soft they looked like a dream. "Get the children something to eat, Christopher. They're shaking." Chambers motioned to the kitchen table. "Come on, you 3. Ada's right. You need food." Baltazar didn't move at first. His body was still in fight mode, ready to bolt at any sound, any shadow. But Celia tugged lightly at his hand, and together they walked into the kitchen. 2 plates sat waiting. Then 3. Then 4. Ada must have known exactly how many were coming. Ivy lunged at the food first, stuffing cornbread into her mouth so fast crumbs flew. Celia followed, tears streaming down her cheeks as she ate like she'd never seen food before. Because truthfully, she hadn't. Not like this. Not clean. Not warm. Not offered freely. Baltazar sat at the table, staring at the meal. His stomach twisted, but not from hunger. From the storm inside him: guilt, terror, relief, exhaustion, and a fear so big it felt like it might burst out of his ribs. Chambers sat across from him. "You can eat, Baltazar," he said softly. But the boy shook his head. "My mama, is she?" "She's alive," Chambers interrupted. "Badly hurt, but alive." The words landed slowly, like drops of water on dry earth. Alive. Baltazar blinked hard, forcing back tears. 8-year-old boys on plantations didn't cry. Crying got you beaten. Crying meant weakness. But here in this strange house, the rules felt slightly different. Only slightly. Because one truth remained. Freedom didn't mean safety. Not yet. Whispers in a new world. While Ada tended to Desa's wounds with a level of skill that came from years of treating escaped and battered people, Chambers returned to the kitchen. He looked exhausted, not physically, but in the soul. Like a man who'd walked into a storm he knew might swallow him whole. He sank into a chair beside Baltazar. "There's something you should know," he said, rubbing his temples. "Word travels fast in Natchez. What happened at Thornhill? People are talking." Baltazar's heart stuttered. "That's bad," he whispered. "People gonna come find us." Chambers inhaled slowly. "Some people might try." Silence. Then, "But others," he continued, "are asking questions they've never dared to ask. About why an 8-year-old child had more courage and decency than 5 grown men. About what your mother endured. About how many other horrors are hidden behind the polite smiles of this city." Baltazar frowned. "They didn't know already?" Chambers shook his head. "They knew. They just didn't want to admit it." He looked out the window at the dark street. "Your courage forced them to look directly at something they've spent generations telling themselves wasn't real." Baltazar picked at the edge of the table. "I didn't feel brave," he murmured. "No one ever does," Chambers said quietly. Not until later. Here comes the hard part. Over the next 3 days, time moved strangely slow and fast at the same time, like a river choked with debris. Ada worked tirelessly on Dessa, cleaned her wounds, locked the door, closed the curtains, kept voices low. Dessa slept most of the first day, drifting in and out with fever. When she finally became alert enough to speak, her voice was ragged, her face swollen, but her eyes were still fire. Chambers visited often but cautiously. He didn't want anyone noticing his carriage at the same house too many times. On the third evening, he sat with the family in the small living room. Ada stood behind him, arms folded, her expression stern. "We need to talk about what comes next," Chambers began. Baltazar's stomach dropped. Not again. Not another danger. Not another unknown. But of course nothing was simple. "Your manumission papers are filed and legal," Chambers continued. "As far as Mississippi law is concerned, you are free." Dessa looked away. Her voice was soft but steady. "Free don't mean safe, Mr. Chambers. Not for colored folks here." "No," he admitted. "It doesn't." Ada stepped forward. "That's why they're going north." Celia's head jerked up. Ivy's eyes widened. Baltazar froze. North. He'd heard the word whispered in quarters. Not as a direction, but as a possibility. A legend. A promise. A rumor. A forbidden dream. Chambers nodded. "There are routes. Safe houses. People who can help. People like Ada. It won't be easy. It won't be quick. But it can be done." Dessa's jaw tightened as if she were gathering strength from air itself. "When do we leave?" "Soon," Ada said. "Very soon. Before Pike and his men sober up enough to start hunting." Baltazar swallowed. "They'll come looking?" Ada didn't sugarcoat it. "They're already looking." A mother's truth. Later that night, after Celia and Ivy finally drifted to sleep, Dessa called to Baltazar from the bed where she rested. "Come here, baby." He crawled beside her, careful not to touch the bruises. Dessa brushed a weak hand across his cheek. "You did what no child should ever have to do," she whispered. "You carried a weight grown men are too scared to lift. You saved me, Baltazar." His throat tightened. "What if I didn't run fast enough? What if—" "Hush." She pressed a finger gently to his lips. "You ran. That's all that matters. You ran because you're your father's son." Baltazar blinked. "My father?" Dessa nodded, eyes glimmering in the lamplight. "Your father, he once tried to stand up for something too. Not the way you did, but enough that it got him sold. They thought removing him would break me." She smiled weakly. "But they didn't know I already had something worth surviving for. You." Baltazar pressed his forehead against her shoulder and exhaled shakily. He didn't cry, but the world softened for a moment. The gift. At dawn the next morning, Chambers returned with papers folded carefully under his arm and something else. A small leather journal. A pencil shaved to a fine point. He handed them to Baltazar. "This is for you." Baltazar stared at it, confused. "I can't read or write." "Not yet," Chambers said. "But you will. And when you do, you're going to write your story. Not the plantations version. Not the white man's version." He paused. "Yours." Baltazar touched the cover gently. "But why me?" "Because," Chambers said, "you've lived through something the world needs to understand. And because thousands of children just like you never got the chance to grow up and tell theirs." Baltazar's throat tightened again. He didn't feel like someone with a story. He felt like someone full of holes. But he held the journal anyway. Departure. They left Natchez before sunrise, when the river fog still clung to the bluffs and the world was quiet enough to hear your own heartbeat. Ada hugged Dessa tightly, whispered instructions to the man guiding them to the first safe house, and pressed a small cloth bundle of food into Celia's hands. Chambers stood a few steps back, eyes somber. Dessa faced him. "You risked your life for us." Chambers shook his head. "You risk yours every day, just by living under Thornhill." Dessa nodded once, an acknowledgement between two people who understood the stakes too well. Then it was time. Baltazar took one last look at the city on the bluffs, at the river, at the sky turning pale gold. "Are we gonna be safe, Mama?" little Ivy asked. Dessa knelt down slowly, painfully, and cupped Ivy's face. "We're gonna be together." She turned to all three children. "And together is the strongest kind of safe there is." Baltazar wasn't sure that was true, but he held her hand anyway. The road north stretched like a question mark into the morning fog, uncertain, dangerous, full of shadows. But for the first time in their lives, the shadows led somewhere other than chains. Somewhere beyond Mississippi, beyond Thornhill, beyond everything they had survived. A place where freedom wasn't a word whispered in fear, but a future waiting to be written. And Baltazar, clutching the leather journal to his chest, knew. One day, he would write it. All of it. Not as a victim, not as a runaway, but as the boy who ran 3 miles in blistering heat to save his mother and changed the course of his family forever.